15. The disintegration and reconstruction of France. Both France and Germany, in the so called Wars of Religion, fell into an advanced state of decomposition. France was torn apart by almost 40 years of civil war between 1562 and 1598, while Germany entered a long period of civil troubles that culminated in the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648. From this decomposition, France recovered in the 17th century, but Germany did not. Political and religious disunity. The wars of religion in France, despite the religious savagery shown by partisans of both sides, were also the 16th century recurrence of a long French political struggle. They were essentially a new form of the old phenomenon of feudal rebellion against a higher central authority. Feudal, in this post medieval sense, generally refers not to nobles only, but to all sorts of groups having rights within the state, and so includes towns and provinces, and even craft guilds and courts of law, in addition to the church and the noble class. It remained to be seen whether all these elements could be welded into one body politic. In France, the early modern new monarchy, building on the work of medieval kings, had imposed a certain unity on the country. Normally, the country acted as a unit in foreign affairs. The king alone made treaties, and in war, his subjects all fought on his side, if they fought at all. Internally, the royal centralization was largely administrative. That is, the king and those who worked for him dealt with subordinate bodies of all kinds, while these subordinate bodies remained in existence with their own functions and personnel. France, by the ideas of the time, was a very large country. It was 3 times as large as England and more than 4 times as populous, roughly 18 million in the 16th century. At a time when travelers could move hardly 30 miles a day, it took 3 weeks of steady plodding to cross the kingdom. Local influence was therefore very strong. Beneath the platform of royalty, there was almost as little substantial unity in France as in the Holy Roman Empire. When the 287 empire had 300 states, France had some 300 areas with their own legal systems. Where the empire had free cities, France had bonnes villes, the king's good towns, each with its stubbornly defended corporate rights. Where the empire had middle sized states like Bavaria, France had provinces as great as some European kingdoms: Brittany, Burgundy, Provence, Languedoc, each ruled by the French king, to be sure, but each with its own identity, autonomy, laws, courts, tariffs, taxes, and parliament or provincial estates. To all this diversity, in France as in Germany, was now added diversity of religion. Calvin himself was by birth and upbringing a Frenchman, and Calvinism spread very rapidly in France during the 1550s. Centralization versus localism. Nor was France much attached to a papal or international Catholicism. The French clergy had long struggled for its national or Gallican liberties. The French kings had dealt rudely with popes, ignored the Council of Trent, and allied for political reasons with both the Lutherans and the Turks. Since 1516, the King of France had the right to nominate 138, the French bishops. The fact that both the French monarchy and clergy already felt independent of Rome held them back from the revolutionary solutions of Protestantism. The Protestantism that eventually spread in France therefore developed without government support and embraced the most radical theological wing of the Reformation, namely Calvinism, which preached at kings, attacked bishops, smashed religious images, and desecrated Catholic churches. Within the main countries that became Protestant, England, North Germany, even the Netherlands, this kind of Protestantism was the doctrine of an extremist minority. In France, there was no middle of the road Protestantism, no broad and comfortable Anglicanism, no halfway Lutheranism inspired by governments. And in the long run, as will be seen, the middle of the road was occupied by Catholics. 288 at first, however, the Huguenots, as the French Calvinists were called, though always a minority, were neither a small group nor modest in their demands. In a class analysis, it is clear that it was chiefly the nobility that was attracted to Protestantism, though of course it does not follow that most French Protestants were nobles, since the nobility was a small class. More than a third, and possibly almost a half, of the French nobility was Protestant by the 1560s or 1570s. Frequently the seigneur, or lord of one or more manors, believed that he should have the right to regulate religion on his own estates, as the princes of Germany decided the religion of their own territories. It thus happened that a lord might defy the local bishop, put a Calvinist minister in his village church, throw out the images, simplify the sacraments, and have the service conducted in French. In this way, peasants also became Huguenots. Occasionally, peasants turned Huguenot without encouragement by the Lord. It was chiefly in southwestern France that Protestantism spread as a general movement affecting whole areas. But in all parts of the country, north as well as south, many towns converted to Protestantism. Usually, this meant that the bourgeois oligarchy, into whose hands town government had generally fallen, went over to Calvinism and thereupon banned Catholic services. The journeyman wage earners might follow along, or estranged by class differences arising from within the local economy, they might remain attached to their old priests. In general, the unskilled laboring population probably remained the least touched of all classes by Calvinist doctrine. The Huguenots. Both Francis I and Henry II opposed the spread of Calvinism, as did Lutheran and Anglican rulers, for Calvinism, rising spontaneously among laity and reforming ministers, seemed to threaten not only the powers of monarchy, but also the very idea of a nationally established church. The fact that in France the nobility, a traditionally ungovernable class, figured 289 prominently in the movement only made it look more like political or feudal rebellion. Persecution of Huguenots, with burnings at the stake, began in the 1550s. Opposition to Calvinism. Then in 1559, King Henry II was accidentally killed in a tournament. He left three sons, of whom the eldest in 1559 was only 15. Their mother, Henry's widow, was Catherine de' Medici, an Italian woman who brought to France some of the Polish of Renaissance Italy, along with some of its taste for political intrigue, with which she attempted to govern the country for her royal sons. Their names were Francis II, who died in 1560, Charles IX, who died in 1574, and Henry III, who lasted until 1589. With no firm hand in control of the monarchy, the country fell apart, and in the ensuing chaos, both Catholic and Huguenot factions tried to get control of the youthful monarchs for their own purposes. The Huguenots, under persecution, were too strong a minority to go into hiding. Counting among their number a third or more of the professional warrior class, the nobles, they took naturally and aggressively to arms. 139. The Civil and Religious Wars. The civil wars in 16th century France were not wars in which one region of a country takes up arms against another, each retaining some apparatus of government, as in the American Civil War or the civil wars of the 17th century in England. They were civil wars of the kind fought in the absence of government. Roving bands of armed men, without territorial base or regular means of subsistence, wandered about the country, fighting and plundering, and joining or separating from other similar bands that were quickly formed or quickly dissolved. The changing economic and social conditions of the era detached many people from their old routines and threw them into a life of adventure. The more prominent leaders could thus easily obtain followers. And at the coming of 290 such cohorts, the peasants usually took to the woods, while bourgeois townspeople would lock the gates of their cities. Peasants would form protective leagues, like vigilantes, and even small towns maintained diminutive armies. The Huguenots were led by various personages of rank, such as Admiral de Coligny and Henry of Bourbon, King of Navarre, a small independent kingdom at the foot of the Pyrenees between Spain and France. A pronounced Catholic party arose under the Guise family, headed by the Duke of Guise and the Cardinal of Lorraine. Catherine de' Medici was left in the middle, opposed like all monarchs to Calvinism, but unwilling to fall under the domination of the Guises. While the Guises wished to extirpate heresy, they wished even more to govern France. Among the Huguenots, some fought for local liberties in religion, while the more ardent spirits hoped to drive idolatry and popery out of all France, and indeed out of the world itself. Catherine de' Medici, for a time, tried to play the two parties against each other. But in 1572, fearing the growing influence of Coligny over the king, and taking advantage of a great gathering of influential Huguenots in Paris to celebrate the marriage of Henry of Navarre, she decided to rid herself of the Huguenot leaders at a single blow. In the resulting massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, some thousands of Huguenots were dragged from their beds after midnight and unceremoniously murdered. Coligny was killed. Henry of Navarre escaped by temporarily changing his religion. St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. This outrage only aroused Huguenot fury and led to a renewal of civil war throughout the country, with mounting atrocities committed by both sides. The armed bands slaughtered each other and terrorized non-combatants. Both parties hired companies of mercenary soldiers, mainly from Germany. Spanish troops invaded France at the invitation of the Guises. Protestant towns, such as Rouen and La Rochelle, appealed for armed support from Elizabeth of England, but Elizabeth was too preoccupied with her own problems to give more than very sporadic and 291 insignificant assistance. Neither side could subdue the other, and hence there were numerous truces, during which fighting still flared up, since no one had the power to impose peace. Gradually, mainly among the more perfunctory Catholics, but also among moderate Protestants, there developed still another group who thought of themselves as the politicals or politiques. The politiques concluded that too much was being made of religion, that no doctrine was important enough to justify everlasting war, that perhaps after all there might be room for two churches, and that what the country needed above all else was civil order. Theirs was a secular rather than a religious view. They believed that people lived primarily in the state, not in the church. They were willing to overlook the religious ideas of people in different churches if such persons would simply obey the king and go peaceably about their business. To escape anarchy, they put their hopes in the institution of monarchy. Henry of Navarre, 140, now again a Protestant, was at heart a politique. Another was the political philosopher John Bodin, 1530 to 1596, the first thinker to develop the modern theory of sovereignty. He held that in every society there must be one power strong enough to give law to all others, with their consent if possible, without their consent if necessary. Thus, from the disorders of the religious wars in France was germinated the idea of royal absolutism and of the sovereign state. The Politiques 292, the Seine, Bartholomew's Day Massacre by François de Bois, French, 1529 to 1584. This massacre of Protestants in Paris in 1572 sparked further atrocities and massacres by both sides in France's religious wars. As the Huguenot painter François de Bois showed in this portrayal of the killings, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre also became an enduring symbol of the brutal conflicts that divided the nation throughout the late 16th century. DEAG. The end of the wars, Reconstruction under Henry IV. In 1589, both Henry III, the reigning king, and Henry of Guise, the Catholic party chief who was trying to depose him, were assassinated by a partisan of the other. The throne now came by legal inheritance to the third of the three Henrys, Henry of Navarre, the Huguenot leader who was quite willing to work with Catholics and even to change his religious affiliations. He reigned as Henry IV. Most popular and most amiably remembered of all French kings, except for medieval St. Louis, he was the first of the Bourbon dynasty, which was to last until the French Revolution. The civil wars did not end with the accession of Henry IV. The Catholic party refused to recognize him, set up a pretender against him, and called in the Spaniards. Henry, the politique, sensed that the majority of the French people were still Catholic and that the Huguenots were not only a minority, but, after 30 years of civil strife, an increasingly unpopular minority. Paris especially, Catholic throughout the wars, refused to admit the 293141 heretic king within its gates. Supposedly remarking that Paris is well worth a mass, Henry IV in 1593 publicly abjured the Calvinist faith and subjected himself to the elaborate processes of papal absolution. Thereupon, the politiques and less excitable Catholics consented to work with him. The Huguenots, at first elated that their leader should become king, were now not only outraged by Henry's abjuration, but also alarmed for their own safety. They demanded positive guarantees for their personal security, as well as protection of their religious liberty. Henry IV accepts Catholicism. Henry IV in 1598 responded by issuing the Edict of Nantes. The edict granted to every seigneur or noble who was also a manorial lord the right to hold Protestant services in his own household. It allowed Protestantism in towns where it was in fact the prevailing form of worship, and in any case in one town of each bailliage, a unit corresponding somewhat to the English shire, throughout the country. But it barred Protestant churches from Catholic episcopal towns and from a zone surrounding and including the city of Paris. It promised that Protestants should enjoy the same civil rights as Catholics, the same chance for public office, and access to the Catholic universities. In certain of the superior law courts, it created mixed chambers of both Protestants and Catholics, somewhat as if a stated minority representation were to be legally required in United States federal courts today. The edict also gave Protestants their own means of defense, granting them about 100 fortified towns to be held by Protestant garrisons under Protestant command. The Edict of Nantes. The Huguenot minority, reassured by the Edict of Nantes, became less of a rebellious element within the state. The majority of the French people, however, viewed the edict with suspicion. The parliaments, or 294 supreme law courts of Paris, Bordeaux, Toulouse, Aix, and Rennes all refused to recognize it as the law of the land. It was the king who forced toleration upon the country. He silenced the parliaments and subdued Catholic opposition by doing favors for the Jesuits. France's chief religious minority was thus protected by the central government, not by popular wishes. Where in England the Catholic minority had no rights at all, and in Germany the religious question was settled only by cutting the country into small and hostile fragments, in France a compromise was effected, by which the Protestant minority had both individual and territorial rights. A considerable number of French statesmen, generals, and other important persons in the 17th century were Protestants. Henry IV, having appeased the religious controversy, did everything that he could to let the country gradually recover from its decades of civil war. His ideal, as he breezily put it, was a chicken in the pot for every Frenchman. He worked also to restore the ruined government, to collect taxes, pay officials, discipline the army, and supervise the administration of justice. Roads and bridges were repaired, and new manufactures were introduced under mercantilist principles. Never throughout his reign of 21 years did he summon the Estates General. A country that had just hacked itself to pieces in civil war was scarcely able to govern itself. And so, under Henry IV, the foundations of the later royal absolutism of the Bourbons were laid down. Henry IV was assassinated in 1610 by a crazed fanatic who believed him a menace to the Catholic Church. Under his widow, Marie de' Medici, the nobility and upper Catholic clergy again grew restless and forced the summoning of the Estates General, in which so many conflicting and mutually distrustful interests were represented that no program could be adopted. Marie dismissed them in 1615 to the general relief of all concerned. No Estates General of the kingdom as a whole thereafter met until 1789. Remembering the violent 142 chaos of the previous century, most people in France, even many nobles, became more willing to accept a national government that would be conducted by and through the king. 295. The Foundations of Absolutism. Cardinal Richelieu. In the name of Marie de' Medici and her young son, Louis III, the control of affairs gradually came into the hands of an ecclesiastic, Cardinal Richelieu. In the preceding generation, Richelieu might have been called a politique. It was the state, not the church, whose interests he worked to further. He tried to strengthen the state economically by issuing mercantilist edicts and by allowing nobles to engage in maritime commerce without loss of noble status. He also made it possible for wholesale merchants to become nobles in return for payments into the royal exchequer. Seeking to expand France's international trade, he founded and supported many commercial companies on the Anglo-Dutch model. For a time, however, it seemed that feuding nobles might cause civil war to break out again. Richelieu therefore prohibited private warfare and ordered the destruction of all fortified castles not manned and needed by the king himself. He even prohibited dueling, a custom much favored by the nobles of the day, but regarded by Richelieu as a mere remnant of private war. The Huguenots, too, with their own towns and their own armed forces under the Edict of Nantes, had become something of a state within the state. In 1627, the Duke of Rohan led a Huguenot rebellion based in the city of La Rochelle, which received military support from the English. Richelieu, after a year, suppressed the rebellion, and in 1629, by the Peace of Alais, amended the Edict of Nantes. For this highly secularized cardinal of the Catholic Church, it was agreeable for the Protestants to keep their religion, but not for them to share in the instruments of political power. The Huguenots lost in 1629 their fortified cities, their Protestant armies, and all their military and territorial rights. But in their religious and civil rights, they were not officially disturbed for another 50 years. Renewed threat of civil war. 296, the French monarchy, having reestablished its centralizing powers and aspirations after the civil wars, now began to revive the old foreign policy of Francis I, who had opposed on every front the European supremacy of the House of Habsburg. The Spanish power still encircled France at the Pyrenees, in the Mediterranean, in the Free County of Burgundy, the Franche-Comté, and in Belgium. The Austrian branch had pretensions to supremacy in Germany and all Central Europe. Richelieu found his opportunity to assail the Habsburgs in the civil and religious struggles that now began to afflict Germany.